So my talk today's, the title is Why Wasn't There Cheese in the Chinese Diet, or Was there? So that I think should give you sort of a hint of what I'm going to talk about. So I'll start by kind of situating this project in a larger sort of book project that I've been sitting on and probably stalling for a little too long. And I'm looking forward to having a conversation about the project and looking forward to ideas that I can sort of use to sort of improve and strengthen it. Okay, so I'm just going to start with a preamble here. I have, I don't know if you can see this. Okay, document from 1504. So this actually is not an early, but sort of, I would say, middle sort of, I would say like early modern sort of Chinese recipe for two different cheeses. Sorry, oops, that's not showing up. The first recipe is actually a soft cheese that's made by heating cow's milk or buffalo milk up with some vinegar and then letting it coagulate after adding some acids, which can be produced in various ways, including vinegar, and then turning that into something very soft like a paneer. And then the second cheese is a more interesting sort of recipe where you take the sort of freshly made soft cheese and you immerse it in hot water. And then it stretches miraculously into some kind of mozzarella-like concoction. Now, both of these recipes appear in a family cookbook dating from 1504 by a fellow named Song Xu. I don't know what happened to my slide. Song Xu was a sort of minor official who lived in the sort of Shanghai region in the middle of the Ming Dynasty, which runs from 1368 to 1644. And he was primarily collecting things that were of personal sort of interest to him. And many of these recipes actually belong to that of his mother. So here we have two recipes, a regular fresh cheese as well as a string cheese. Now, if you sort of check out the cookbook, which I think is fascinating and has yet to be translated, it has many recipes that involve cheese. There are cheese that are stuffed into ravioli, cheese put into various sweets, into dumplings, into wonton skins, into seafood. It's a recipe book with so much cheese that I think there is as much cheese as tofu in it, which is quite striking since most of us understand tofu to be a staple of the Chinese diet, at least since the 10th or 11th century. Now, just to give you a sort of a visual representation of these cheeses, they still exist in Southwest China, where they have been, I think, mislabeled as sort of a unique minority food, because the Southwest of China is an area that has many sort of assimilated Han sort of minority groups living there. And I'll get back to that point at the end of this talk. So if you go to the capital of Yunnan province called Kunming, you'll find actually a famous cheese that is the same fresh cheese that I just described, stir-fried like paneer with some ham. And then here are sort of the blocks of the cheese that you would find in the markets of this region, quite fresh, often made with goat's milk, but also cow's milk if you don't like goat's milk. And then here is the string cheese, which people sort of dry and then deep fry or grill. This is actually a popular snack in the Southwest, made not only by sort of Chinese vendors of various sort of ethnic backgrounds, including Muslims, but also some of the local Bai peoples. So a very popular snack. So it's a living tradition. And then here's my attempt to create the recipe from 1504 myself. I was actually quite skeptical when I first ran across a recipe that you could make string cheese with just vinegar and hot water. But I guess the key, as I discovered, is that you need raw milk, which is something that is only legal to actually buy in two states in the United States, California and New York. So I went to give a talk in California and spent a good part of the afternoon trying to find raw milk. And then after I put my child to bed, I decided to try the reconstruction, and much to my delight, the cheese stretched only with a little bit of hot water. So here I am sort of with a bad haircut and in pajamas, but, sort of doing a victory lap. So this I think is Mr. Song's cheese. Okay, so why do I care about the cheese, or why should you care? Well, I think the sort of presence of cheese in Chinese cookbooks, and this I will sort of, give you a heads up, this is not the only cookbook, is something that's a surprise to many of us who know Chinese food, know Chinese history, or just know China. China is known for many things, but it's not a country that is well known for its cheese, or more broadly, its dairy products. In fact, I think there have been, many articles, many books, chapters, that have, talked about the sort of famous Chinese sort of absence of cheese and dairy products. And so they're to sort of cite a famous sort of example, Mark Kurlansky, in 2018 published a book about the history of milk. And he has this sort of rather standard observation, namely that throughout history, the Han, as the ethnic Chinese call themselves, as opposed to Mongolians, Tibetan, and other sort of minorities living in the area, have rarely eaten dairy food. Okay, so that I think is a pretty uncontroversial sort of concept, or claim, which I am going to sort of push up against a little bit. All right, so I found these recipes about cheese, references to cheese, and I was very, very surprised. Now, after I found this particular reference, I started doing a lot of digging, and for over the course of 6 months, I sort of looked at every single cookbook from premodern China that I could find. And much to my sort of delight and surprise, I've discovered that there was a long history of dairy consumption in China. But what also was sort of strange to me is that sort of tradition has largely been ignored by food historians and scholars. Instead, when people do talk about sort of the question of dairy in China, it's largely a question of why it didn't exist. And so the scholarship on the, has touched upon the topic and asked, maybe from my perspective, several rather problematic questions about milk, which is they sort of framed sort of the milk question in terms of the failure of China to develop, a fully fledged dairy industry that is similar to what we have in the West. And so the questions have included things like, why did dairy fail to become a staple of the diet until the 20th or 21st century? What biological, cultural, or environmental factors precluded a milking tradition in China? And so often you'll have references to sort of limited land for grazing, or I would say more problematically, the idea that the Chinese are incapable of digesting, milk sugars, and that's why they didn't sort of, they eat everything but, in dairy products like cheese. So these are the kinds of questions that I am sort of reacting to. And what I would say is that these are questions that are, I think, suffer from the tendency of being teleological. I think it starts with the idea that milk is a natural food that under normal circumstances most societies would move towards having a fully fledged dairy industry like we do in the 20th and 21st centuries. I also think that this question is very ahistorical. We know from, I think now a sizable literature on the history of milk in the West that fresh milk consumption, for example, is a relatively short tradition in the Western world. It's also not sort of necessarily sort of universal. Many places, in fact, until recently, did not consume all that much dairy. And then also that European access to dairy varied and waxed and waned over time, including in places like Britain. There are points in British history where, people in southern England had lost their access to dairy because of things like enclosure or changes in land ownership and resource constraints. And so these are the kinds of, I think, questions that, this literature sort of pushes us to look, I think, deeper or looks further beyond the sort of issue of failure. Now, in terms of China, I think the questions of why China failed to develop milk also ignores the fact that there is a long milking tradition in China. And if you sort of follow archaeology, one of the things that came out last year, actually, is that archaeologists discovered evidence of milking in China that dates to the 8th century BC from north central China, the province of Shanxi. So if you go to the map, it's the state of Zhao, which is in, I guess, a nice brown color. This is traditionally an area where farming communities bump up against nomadic peoples, and not surprisingly, the milking traditions, spread to sort of everyday peasant life in the 8th century. So, not surprisingly, you have milk, where it's and when the opportunity arises. So that's a big find, and I'm looking forward to seeing more on it. And then I think there's sort of a bigger problem apart from my glamour shot here, which is that you have thousands upon thousands of references to dairy products in China's pre-modernity, references to milk as medicine for things like diarrhea, references to milk as a delicious food, milk as a sort of metaphor for culinary excellence. Many poems, in fact, compare a particular food to butter or to any other or to milk, and that's usually a good sign. It's also a metaphor for sensuality. And milk becomes a status marker in Chinese history. People who can afford milk are special, are rich and powerful, or important. And then milk finally becomes very important as a representation of cultural memory, especially in periods where the Chinese are forced to move to the south because of nomadic invasions. So when they think about the north that they lost, they think of it in terms of the milk. But that's a different talk. Okay, so I just want to sort of briefly describe the project that this talk will sort of fit into. So I'm going to be writing a book eventually called Forgotten Delicacy, Dairy in the Yangtze Delta. And this is a book that I hope will tell a new story about milk consumption in pre-modernity. And I'm hoping that it's sort of broader contribution to people who don't particularly care about China is this, that it teaches us a new way of thinking about sort of food, thinking about beyond the framework of consumption, or sort of calories and nutrition, and diet. And what I mean by this is that I would like people to start to think about food as sort of a creative or cultural resource. And this, I hope, will offer an alternative to a story that has largely been dominated by a scholarship that talks about the rise of factory farming, of canning, of pasteurization, of milk drinking campaigns, and modernity, among other things. So what I'm going to be doing here is talking about milk as a comestible, something that you not only ingest as, a source of calories, but you consume it as a cultural object. And I hope that this sort of approach will allow us to think about milk as something that is not only good to eat, but good to think with, and, something that we can explore or delve into its many meanings. Now, I'm going to also just do it from the perspective of one province in China. As you know, as geographers and historians alike, that China is a huge place. It's continent sized. So you're obviously going to get a lot of diversity, and it's generally better to sort of focus on one place over a few centuries. What I'm going to do is a little unusual. I'm going to avoid the most obvious places to look, which is China of the north, the steppeland, where you still have pastoral communities. So this is a picture of milk tea that is sold in a Mongolian restaurant in Beijing. Mongolians obviously are the world's most prolific milk sort of consumers, but they are generally not thought of as sort of classically Chinese. Instead, I'm going to be focusing on the Yangtze Delta, which is the larger Shanghai region. So this is an area that is very wealthy, very picturesque. It's sort of, what I think most of us think of as sort of classically sort of Chinese or Han Chinese settlement area. And I'm going to be talking about it in respect to this area called it's called Jiangnan, south of the river, but it's basically the area that sort of hugs the river Taihu, which is shown in the middle of this map here. So this is South China. It is considered rich China. It's culturally dominant China, and it's also culinarily dominant China. And it's China that has, I think, some of the best landscapes, the richest sort of gourmet tradition, and not surprisingly, the best documentation. So just one more picture to give you a sense of the location. It's hot and tropical, so really not an ideal place also to have a dairy tradition, but as we will see, that wasn't actually a sort of an obstacle. Okay, so I'm going to talk about this area, even though it's not an obvious place to raise cattle or sheep, because of its sort of the richness of its documentary record. And what I think this documentary record, which will include sort of writings that are found in books on connoisseurship and poetry, in debates about court expenditure and medical and religious treatises, cookbooks, and some pornography, is it will allow us to sort of delve into the many meanings of milk and the many uses of it. So I'll just give you a brief overview of the sort of chapter outlines currently. So in the book, I talk about how milk came to this sort of hot and tropical region, largely came after the North China collapsed during an invasion from the north. And I'll talk a lot about how, milk becomes very important in monasteries and monastic sort of traditions it's a sort of a key food for vegetarians. It's also a food that is very popular in Chinese medical traditions, which owe much to the traditions from India. And then it becomes also a food that is a marker of luxury. The Chinese love their rich milk products, their cheeses, their butters, especially their clarified butters. And even though this it becomes in some cases quite cost prohibitive, it becomes sort of the ultimate luxury product. Then I'll talk about how milk, works as a poetic trope in sort of early modern China, before turning to the question of why milk faded from the diets of people in the Yangtze Delta in the 17th and 18th, in the 18th and 19th centuries. So today's talk, which I think of more as a mini talk, will focus on the sort of sixth chapter, the last of the milk, the question of why milk consumption declined in the 18th and 19th centuries. And I'm going to sort of present, I think, a standard historian's argument. I'm going to focus on, what we call contingent factors. So the idea here is that there's nothing inedible about the fading of milk from the Chinese diet. It's not that the Chinese couldn't handle it or they hated it. It's something that happened largely by accident. And I would argue that two factors in particular sort of contributed to this sort of accidental decline. The first is that milk was really at some level a victim of its own success. The Chinese loved their milk. They loved it rich and they loved it scarce. And the more scarce a food is, the more valuable it is. And this is kind of logic ultimately sort of made it vulnerable to changes in the environment. And then I'll talk a lot about the second factor, which I think plugs into sort of discussions of geography, I think a little better, which is that milk becomes, and ultimately cheese, becomes vulnerable to changing economic conditions in China and broader shifts in food production that result from the introduction of new world crops and population pressures that sort of fuel the popularity of those crops. So more on that in a second. Okay, so what am I going to do next? I'm going to just describe the milking culture before the 18th century and then talk about the reasons why it declined in cooking, and then briefly touch upon some thoughts about, the afterlife of milk, and then, maybe some conclusions. So I'll start with the, the sort of the prehistory or the, milk before its decline. So we know milk gets a late start in the Yangtze Delta. There's a famous story about an encounter between two Chinese aristocrats, one from the north and one from the south in the 5th century. And the northerner is drinking his goat yogurt happily, and the southerner is eating some kind of seaweed stew, and they, basically argue about who has the best food. But it's clear from this anecdote and from others that, the southerners are really unfamiliar and actually unimpressed with goat and sheep yogurt, and that it's not something that is part of their diet, at least in the 5th century. Now we know that, by the 12th century, the situation is completely different. Many people from North China have moved from the north to the south as a result of the Jurchen invasion, which happens in 1126. And at that point, the capital of Kaifeng in the north collapses, and tens, if not hundreds of thousands of Chinese end up moving to Hangzhou, which is a temporary capital in the Shanghai region. And there they make a huge effort to reconstruct the diets that they had in the north, in the capital. They bring many of the same restaurants, they bring the recipes, they even bring their dairies and their sheep so that they can continue eating the way they had in the north, with the idea that eventually, and this doesn't happen, that they will be able to return to their homes and go back to life as normal. So just in case you're wondering how on earth you can have sheep in a subtropical region, here is actually the breed of sheep that they brought in 1126 to the south. This is called basically river sheep. They're not doing that well here, but they actually are still around. And as you can see from in the background, they're living among bamboo plants. So they managed to the Chinese figured out how to keep them alive. And they were producing yogurt, milk for yogurt, actually, as late as the 13th century. So, this is something that happened as a result of this, exodus of people from the north. And then, in terms of where people sort of moved their dairy, sort of producing animals, they moved them into the hills. So here actually is a famous area in Suzhou, which is a city that's now a suburb of Shanghai. Suzhou had these beautiful bucolic hills, and this actually is a village that was particularly famous for its rich butter. And so the grazing, we know, happened in places like this village. Today, of course, this is a military installment. And so if you go up the hill, you're sent back, and there are cameras everywhere. Okay, so we know that after 1126, cities like Suzhou become dairy centers in this sort of new southern sort of Chinese state. And from sources, we know that farmers really have to sort of feed the demand for butter, for cheese, for yogurt, and largely they end up taking their sort of animals, their buffaloes, their cows, and their sheep up into the hills, which are everywhere in the south, and grazing them there. And they also become quite good at feeding these animals well. We know that they're eating rice stems, and plenty of legumes. This is actually an old practice that begins as early as the 6th century in China. But we know from these records also that the farmers are able to produce milk year round, including during the winter, which is not traditionally, of course, the time that animals lactate. But they were able to do this largely for a luxury market, where aristocrats want their milk, year round. So certain towns become famous for their creamy milk and cheeses, and also for just dairy products in general. And Suzhou actually is one of the big centers. Now, this starts probably in the 13th century, but it continues all the way through the early 17th century. So when Matteo Ricci comes to visit and stay in China, he actually makes a sort of stunning observation that in no place in all China is more butter and milk used than in the city of Suzhou in the province of Nanjing. And this is a guy, of course, who lives in Beijing part-time too. So it's clear this tradition continues for centuries. Now, we also know that the sort of milk that is being consumed tends to be creamier than what we Americans are used to. So there is no such thing as low-fat milk. That is something that no one would be interested in consuming in early modernity. The milk that was produced from the yellow cattle, which is sort of the classic draft animal in China, has milk fat in the area of probably 6 to 8%. This is a number that is arrived at at the end of the 19th century. Some missionary colleges, tried to sort of push dairy, and they ended up experimenting on native draft animals and testing their sort of the creaminess of the milk, and also their sort of the amount of milk that they give. We also know that buffalo milk from China has even higher milk fat, and that the further south you go, the more sort of buffalo milk you will get, because cows don't really handle the temperatures as well. And we also know that there is a distinct preference in China for milky, sort of creamier milk with a lot more fat than sort of, and that there's a preference for sort of, milk fat over quantity. So even into the 20th century, Chinese dairy farmers would actually select the animals that produce the thicker milk as opposed to animals that produced, a lot more milk. And so an example of this actually is in the Pearl River Valley. The city of Shunde is very famous for its cheeses, and there the farmers make a point of only using swamp buffaloes, which have extremely low yields, but very, very rich milk. And then just to give you a sense of how much milk is being produced in this world, if you're taking a yellow humped cattle, for an example, you'll probably get 130 gallons of milk per year. And I think this is, less than half of what you'd be getting from the Dutch cattle from the same time period. So, paltry yields, but I would say higher quality milk if you appreciate milk fat, which is what the Chinese seem to prefer. So rich milk. Okay, so what do they do with the milk, which they're able to get year round for these cities, which are quite prosperous in early modernity? Well, they get a lot of cheese out of it, actually. They do many things. They don't just make fresh and string cheese. They also, take their fresh cheeses and preserve them in ash. They use them to make literally cheese baklava. They put the soft the fresh cheese into a dough, which they sort of roll out very thin, like phyllo dough, and grill with, sweet nuts and honey and butter. They also use, dairy products to make pastries. butter, milk, yogurt, cheese. They also marinate their cheeses and take them with tea and alcohol. They cook with their cheese. They add it to shellfish. They also take slabs of cheese and they stuff them in the insides of fish and steam them to produce sort of these very sort of, I would say, interesting sort of seafood dishes. And then they take the fresh milk and they add rice beer to it to produce a soft sort of curd that is similar to junket, which people now call palace cheese. So these are just a few applications that we find in this sort of Shanghai region in early modernity. And then here's a picture of a dish that I reconstructed. So one thing we know that they do is they like to put cheese and vegetables together. They have a sort of an equivalent dish to the Buddha's delight, but instead of tofu, they use cheese. They also use buffalo cheese to sort of bring out the flavors of steamed mustard greens. So I ended up eating too much cheese before I was able to make the dish, but I think the idea was that you had a thick layer of cheese that doesn't melt, that goes on top of the vegetables. And this was considered, an elegant sort of dish in, the 14th and 15th centuries. Excuse me. We also know that in early modernity, so the 15th and 16th century, dairy products are not really everyday foods, even in this sort of rich region. They are largely a luxury product, in part because there really isn't much grazing land. And, the animals don't produce that much milk themselves. But this is for, I think, the Chinese, not really a problem. For them, the scarcity of milk is actually a sign of its value. It speaks to the fact that it's a rarity. It's something that is precious, that has to be savored and is reserved for the rich and powerful. So not surprisingly, in famous sort of novels of manners like the Jinping, which is famous for its, or notorious for its pornographic sort of content, milk products and cheeses are associated with the rich diets of sensual merchants who live sort of excessive and overly sort of ostentatious lifestyles. It's also a food that is associated with imperial privilege. If you look at court records, there's actually a high degree of correlation between the sort of rank of a person and how much milk and cheese they get to consume. And this is true not only of the Qing dynasty, which is ruled by people who are from aliens, but also the native Ming dynasty. There's a big sort of deal made of milk and milk products and actually even ice cream at the court. And then milk is also, because it's a luxury product and something that is expensive to produce, it's considered a decadent food. So whenever the emperor would have to go on an austerity campaign because of some kind of disturbance or eclipse or anything that might challenge his rule, one of the first foods he would have to cut back on is dairy to show that he was being conscientious. Now, what's interesting is that despite the costs involved and the fact that this is a luxury product, cheese and dairy products, really are very common in Chinese cookbooks from the Yangtze Delta up until the 18th century. Now, this, of course, is a reflection of the fact that the Yangtze Delta is a very, very wealthy place in China. I mean, it's, if you sort of trust some of the work that has been done on this subject, it's sort of standard of living in the Yangtze Delta up until the 18th century is commensurate with the Netherlands. But after the 18th century, dairy products begin to really drop out of Chinese cookbooks. And the question is, why does this happen? And the decline is actually really sharp over the course of the 19th century, so much so that by the early 20th century, people who are writing about dairy products in this region, largely treat it as a sort of Western or foreign food. They want it, but it's clear to from the way they write about it, it's not something that they have on a regular basis. So that's a sort of major change that is sort of worth asking. Why does this happen? So why does it happen? Well, what I would sort of say first is that milk doesn't entirely disappear. It just becomes very, very scarce in the 19th century. So it's still there in these famous pharmacopoeia that are largely sort of, built around sort of different recipes for what they call rejuvenating kanjis, sort of medicinal food. And there it becomes clear that milk is something that is so expensive, so rare, that it has to be reserved for people that are very vulnerable, the young and the elderly. Now, what's really interesting is that some of the cows that you find in these cookbooks, the cow's milk actually is extra special, is that if you're going to make a rejuvenating congee, you're going to get cows who've been fed a diet of heavy metals. And heavy metals are important in Chinese pharmacopoeia because they are actually believed to be like elixirs of immortality. So what you're doing is you're adding sort of some extra value to your milk, which is already in itself considered to be a potent medicine. Okay, so as to why it changes and why it disappears, I think it largely has to do with sort of environmental reasons. So this is sort of an, I think, less controversial statement, but it's well known that, China has this sort of enormous population increase in early modernity. So at the end of the 16th century, there's an estimated 150 million people in China proper. By the end of the 19th, that number has shot up to at least 400 million, though, there's some debate about exactly the figure. So as the population is increasing at, I would say, breakneck pace, what is happening is the land under cultivation is declining, especially in the 16th and 17th century. This in part is due to things like soil erosion that happens because of environmental reasons and also from over cultivation. And at that point, really, the lowlands, which is where people grow their staple grains, are completely sort of taken up. So by wheat fields, rice fields, and millet. So I just want to go back to the hills. So you have all this excess population. Where do you send people at that point, right? Where, obviously, if you have a lot of hungry, landless peasants, you have a wonderful recipe for uprising or rebellion. Well, this is the question, right, that Chinese officials in the 16th and mostly 17th century debated, which is, where do we send the poor? Now, the one area that isn't sort of really given to cultivation in Chinese history is the hills. Those have historically been sparsely populated, often by various indigenous tribes in the south and southwest, sometimes pastoralists. This is an area that cannot be used to grow cereal grains because rice and wheat and millet don't thrive up there. The soil is too rocky and thin. So, historically before the 18th century, that land was used to grow things like orchids, to put monasteries up there, and also to, fodder animals. So we know that, if you had a cow or a sheep or a goat or a buffalo, you were feeding them with by taking them up into the hills and mountains. And that's where they got their feed for the most part. Now, we also know that because of the sort of fact that you can't grow grains, Chinese are not living up there in large numbers. So this is something that is going to change with, New World crops. So New World crops show up in the late 16th century. Officials start to really look at these as a sort of a solution to their problems of, feeding sort of China's extra population. And one thing about maize and sweet potatoes and potatoes is that these plants or crops grow well in the highlands as well as in lowlands. So Chinese officials realize this and immediately, get on sort of the bandwagon of sending their poor into the hills, basically telling them to start planting sweet potatoes. And this is exactly what happened. So in the 18th and 19th century, the poor start coming in from all parts of China, mostly from contiguous areas, into the Yangtze Delta. And they are basically moving into the hills and mountains and completely turning everything into a corn or sweet potato sort of field. And so the results look something like this. So this is not far from the bucolic site that I showed you initially. As you can see from the land, this is really land where the trees have been cut down. There's been a lot of planting. The government's trying to change that now because it contributed to soil erosion and landslides. But this area has just been, over sort of taken for centuries by corn and especially sweet potato farming. So obviously, once you have sweet potatoes, you get, the farmers who are, taking care of cattle are basically displaced. And in fact, this is something that is well attested in the sort of local gazetteers or local histories of the era, which is that people looking, starting in the 18th and 19th and 20th centuries, start to look back and notice that the animals have largely disappeared from the landscape. So in the 1930s, for example, one Jiangsu native actually sort of tells us quite neatly that before the 19th century, there were pastures, that and there were animal fodders that could support large herds of cows or water. But after that time, cultivated fields grew more numerous by day and the grasslands dwindled, driving up the grass and feed. And he also notes that this is particularly true of the highlands, where the animals had previously been sort of kept. Okay, so that I think is my explanation of why sort of the milking tradition waxed and waned in this region. But I just want to come back to one point, which is that milk, fades from the Chinese diet, over the 19th century, or at least the diet of the Yangtze Delta, but it ultimately comes back really 150 years later. So what's interesting is that in the 1930s, the cities of Nanjing, Hangzhou, and Shanghai, which were the early modern capitals of milk, the rich parts of China, end up driving the modern dairy industry in China proper. And they produce actually half of all the milk that's consumed in the 30s, which I find striking. But by this time, of course, the people who are trying to sort of move what they consider the sort of dial forward and bring milk to everyone in China are actually rather sort of concerned about sort of the lack of milk in the everyday diet. They actually complain quite loudly that, the problem of China isn't the lack of milk. It was the fact that milk was an aristocratic food, and that, that it was it was scarce. And for them, this sort of attitude was actually a social problem and ultimately a sign of Chinese backwardness, which they would like to change. So that I thought was sort of an interesting tidbit. Okay, in terms of conclusions, and I don't know if I've gone too fast or not, or I'm right on time. So what can we learn from
right on time?
I'm right on time. Okay, great. So I guess I'm trying to provide a new answer to the old question about what happened to cheese in China, or why, and I think also there's just another sort of I don't know, how would I say, potential sort of payoff of this project is, I think it's fun to work on sort of forgotten foods that have faded. I find them to be kind of an interesting case because, too often we write about foods that become important, right? And usually it's a story about how, a just so story, a story about how how the things that we take for granted today came to be. But often we don't write about things that have disappeared. And that for me is quite interesting. And then I guess I think of the Chinese case as an alternative, offering a sort of a corrective maybe to a literature that has been hitherto very focused on the modern dairy industry and its origins. I think this is a literature that today has kind of moved away from a lot of the sort of rhetoric that the milk industry pushed in the 19th century, but it's still a story that I think has its beginnings in an industry that, treat it, that really tried to sell, milk as a natural food, right? Even though it wasn't. And it's also, I guess I think of my story as also pushing it back against an earlier sort of Victorian narrative about, the milklessness of China as a sign of its backwardness or a deficiency in the diet that needs somehow to be corrected and explained. Instead, I think the story of milk allows us to imagine a sort of a different kind of world, a world where, milk doesn't have to be everywhere to be sort of normal. It's a world where milk is scarce, and that's what makes it valuable. It's also a world where people choose to have less milk, but better milk, which I think is an interesting idea. And, in this age, there's a lot of awareness of sort of the ecological impact of the milk industry, the way that, milk has, destroyed water resources, the way that it, contributing to the destruction of the Amazon, how it's, polluting our waterways, our fields, leading to methane emissions and so forth and so forth. And so perhaps, the lesson to be taken here is that, we don't need more milk necessarily. We need richer milk that we, sort of enjoy or savor a little bit more. And I will stop here.